Hello, everybody. My name is Mary Rice. I am a mezzo-soprano, and at the Marshall Opera Oral History Project, I will be performing I'm Told I'm a Citizen from Mrs. President by Victoria Bond. I'm delighted to be speaking with Miss Bond today to discuss her life and work and her compositions. Victoria, it's lovely to have you here today.
Thank you, Mary. I'm happy to be speaking with you.
Yes, it's so exciting to get to work with somebody who has been composing for such a long time, looking through your body of work and your personal history. It seems like you got into music from a very young age, and at this point, you have performed kind of everything everywhere from New York City Opera to the Shanghai Symphony Orchestra. You've written operas and ballets, piano concerti, choral works, oratorios across multiple religious
My
and
goodness.
secular themes. Yeah, you've really done it all. For our audience, Ms. Bond is also the first woman to hold a doctoral of conducting from Juilliard. In addition to, you worked as the assistant conductor for New York City Opera under Beverly Sills. You've really done it all. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what that journey through the upper echelons of a very, very male-dominated field was like for you?
Well, first of all, I want to say I very much relate to you and your work because my second instrument was as a singer, and so
Really?
yes, my performance instrument. Let me back up a little bit and say that I come from a long line of musicians. My parents were musicians. Both of my parents were professional musicians. Their parents were musicians, and so it seemed very inevitable that I would also be a musician. I went into the family business, if you will. And my father was a singer. He sang at New York City Opera. And so I learned the bass repertoire at a very early age. And I was in the children's chorus of the New York City Opera. So that was where I got my first taste of participating in an opera. And it was heady. I just loved it. And I knew that I wanted to spend my life in this profession. As far as instruments, my mother was a pianist, so my first instrument was piano. But my parents discovered that I had a very nice voice. I was a lyric soprano, and so I studied singing. And because my mother had been a pianist, it was not really the profession I was going to go into because by the time my mother was 10, she had already played solo with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. She was born in
Mm.
Chicago, and she had played a concerto at the age of 10 and won the list competitions. So there were all sorts of things that she had done at a very early age. And I thought, well, I'm not going to go in that direction. That was her path. So I thought that my dual life was going to be as a composer and a singer. And I guess I should back up and say that I like to make things up from the earliest age. I didn't know it was called composition, but I like to make up stories on the piano. And so that was really the main focus of what I wanted to do. But my parents, both being professional musicians, said, you can't just be a composer, you have to have a performing instrument. So I thought my dual life would be as a composer and singer. And my role model in that um, was, oh gosh, I'm blanking on his name now. Samuel Barber, there we go, was Samuel Barber
Oh.
as a singer and
Hmm.
composer. And I loved his music. And of course, he wrote so beautifully for the voice because he had the experience of singing his own works.
Yes.
So all of my early compositions were for voice and piano. And so that sort of set me on the path to opera, which, as I say, felt very natural. And the subject of Mrs. President in particular was something that was suggested to me by my mother. I was working on another opera at the
Really?
time, but my mother lived in Los Angeles and she was traveling to San Francisco and stayed at a hotel that had a little brass plaque that said, Victoria Woodhull, first woman to run for president, slept here. So that was all that was on that plaque, and that totally
The
intrigued her. And she
entirety
said,
of her story in that one
yeah,
sentence.
Yeah, so my mother said, well, this is an interesting subject for an opera. Why don't you look into it? And the further I looked, the more excited I became because, of course, her story is the stuff that grand opera is made of.
It really
has-
is. She was quite the
she
character.
was a wild one. She was not
Very colorful personal life, to put it
exactly colorful. She
diplomatically.
was really quite well. It involves political intrigues, sexual harassment, all of the subjects that are so much in the news today. I mean, these are subjects that are evergreen. The year was 1872 that she ran for president. And of course, women's rights were far behind what they are now because
Right. She
women
couldn't even
women
vote
couldn't
for
even vote
herself
at
in her
the time.
own campaign.
Exactly. But some of the other things, such as her relationship with Henry Ward Beecher and the fact that, I guess spoiler alert, I shouldn't give the story away, or should I? You tell
I
me.
mean, it's a historical figure. I think you can probably get away with a few spoilers.
Okay. So Victoria Woodhull discovered that Henry Ward Beecher, who was the most prominent preacher of his day and a figure that was held in awe by people because of his brilliant sermons and his outlook towards emancipation. We first meet him in the opera where he is buying the freedom of a young Black girl who has run away from her masters, and he exhorts his congregation to help buy her freedom from her slave owner. And so, when we first meet him, he's a really good guy, and his speeches are brilliant. He's very much in favor of women's equality. So, very much like a Sarastro and the Queen of the Night in the Magic Flute. When we first meet the Queen of the Night, we think she is the heroine, and it's Sarastro who is the villain. So I really loved that kind of a switch when we find out that the Queen of the Night is really the villain and Sarastro the hero. So in the beginning of Mrs. President, Henry Ward Beecher is the hero, and Victoria Woodhull is a bit of a question mark in our mind. I wouldn't
Yes.
say she's a villain, but there's a question mark.
She does not
But
fall
what
very clearly into one side of I'm supposed to unequivocally root for this person or I'm supposed to hope for their downfall. It is tricky to find exactly how you're supposed to feel about her from the first couple moments that we see her.
Right, exactly. And so what Victoria Woodhull discovered, because she acted as a consultant and a helper to a lot of women who were having marital problems, who were facing harassment. She was like their confessor, as it were. She was a spiritualist, a very spiritual person. And so they would come to her with their problems. And so through these women, she discovered that Henry Ward Beecher was carrying on clandestine affairs with a number of his female parishioners. And so that was sort of the background. Then in the foreground, she, as somebody who wanted to run for president more because she wanted the issues of women's equality and free love, which I'll describe in a minute, to be the important issues, even though she knew she would never be elected president because, as we said, women couldn't vote. But she wanted that platform to give her a voice that people would hear. And who would support her? Henry Ward Beecher was the logical person, and she had the dirt on him. So, as I say, she was no angel, but her goals were truly important ones. So basically, she says, support my campaign or I will publish the information about you in my newspaper. Oh, by the
Yeah,
way,
it'll
she
ruin
also
your
had a
image.
newspaper. She was also the first woman to hold a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. I mean, absolutely remarkable person with no education or political background. She just
Yeah.
learned from the people she was with, and she just absorbed everything.
Yeah,
So
she's got a
basically,
sort of
she
ferocious will.
absolutely, that's a good word, ferocious. She definitely was. She was a force of nature. And so basically, Henry Ward Beecher realizes that he is caught in a bind. And not only that, there's a scene, a love scene, which ends the first act. You might question the word love, but there is a scene that ends the first act where these two predators, as it were, Henry Ward Beecher and Victoria Woodhull, recognize that aspect of each other which
Yeah.
they adore, and they're very attracted to each other, she to
Yeah.
him as well as he to her. And
Like
so here are
recognizes
these
like.
two sworn enemies. Basically, they get it on, but the
Yeah.
curtain comes down before that happens.
Classic enemies to lovers. Everybody loves a good enemies to lovers art.
Exactly. Yeah, they're so similar that they're just it's like a magnet drawing them to each other. And
Yeah.
then in the beginning of the second act, Henry Ward Beecher says, "What? Am I crazy? I mean, this woman is going to destroy me." So then he summons all of his forces. Originally, the opera was called Mrs. Satan, because that is what she was called in the press. That was in the opera. Henry Ward Beecher calls out her name, Mrs. Satan. So we decided not eventually to use that title because it implies too many things that are really not related to the opera.
Yeah,
But there,
it's not the core theme that runs through, because ultimately so much of this balance of gendered politics and sort of the Machiavellian infighting that goes on between these two intensely political figures comes down to the fact that she wants to overturn the balance of power that exists in
exactly.
society, in which this preacher will always come out on top because he is a man, regardless of how much she had earned her way, if we can use a slightly loaded term, into the position of power that she held.
Well, you know how controversial powerful women are today, and how they get,
Yes,
well, look at Hillary Clinton as a perfect
indeed.
example of, particularly during her run with Trump, how she was excoriated, how she was called names. I mean, calling her Mrs. Satan would not be beyond what uh, some of the politicos would have
Might be
called
on the
her.
tamer side of things, if we're being perfectly frank.
Yeah, yeah, right. I mean, there it was unbridled name calling. But one of the
Absolutely.
things I wanted to explain was this idea of free love. I mean, can you imagine anyone today having a platform where the word free love was part of it? I mean, that'd be as controversial today as it was then. And it was misunderstood then as it would be today, because
Right.
what he meant by free love was that a woman had the freedom to leave a relationship where love was no longer involved. And in those days, of course, if a woman could get divorced, but if she got divorced, she lost her right to her children. She lost her right to her property. She was a pariah in society. And
Right.
so many women hung on to their marriages just because they didn't want to lose those things.
Exactly. I mean, it was another century before, women could even open a credit card in their own name.
And if you look at other parts of the world, needless to say, this is still going on, arranged marriages and forced marriages. So it ain't over yet. There's still so much further to go. And even though we think that a lot of these problems have been solved in this country, worldwide, we see that the same thing is going on, and we have so much further to go.
I think it's not necessarily a huge question as to why you would choose to write about women. There are so many fascinating historical figures, wonderful stories to plumb for retellings across many genres. But what I am very interested in is you have written works that center male political figures as well. For example, Sublimation, where a lot of the text is drawn from the writings of Teddy Roosevelt, FDR, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, which those political figures, of course, were operating and existing in many of the same spheres as someone like Victoria Woodhull. And you've written, your opera about Clara Schumann. And I cannot help but think that over the course of writing those operas, you must encounter a very different atmosphere when you're figuring out how to tell these individuals stories. You know, do you approach the musical language differently? Do you feel differently about how you set a scene because of what we are comfortable with as far as tropes go, what our preconceived ideas are about how these people interact with one another? I'm really curious about what is under the hood of constructing an opera about a woman versus constructing an opera about a man when we live in a society that is primed to immediately take the man's story seriously, but to disbelieve the integrity of the woman from the outset.
Excellent question. And I want to start with Thomas Jefferson because he is such a controversial figure. And even though I didn't write an opera about him, I wrote a work for narrator and string orchestra and solo violin called Soul of a Nation. Now, in my own mind, I have to make a separation between the work and the person. And I've done this with many people, notably among them Richard Wagner, whose work I absolutely love, and whose politics and whose attitude towards Jews, myself being Jewish, was awful. But I love his music, and I feel that the humanity that he expresses in his music is something of tremendous value. So let's shift over to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, as we know, was a slaveholder. We know all about his relationship with his mistress, I guess you can call it. And those things, of course, are reprehensible. However, Thomas Jefferson was a genius, and he gave us basically the Declaration of Independence. And even though he did not abide by every aspect of it, he had the vision to do this. And I think that is something that needs to be celebrated. Also, he was a very private person. And Soul of a Nation takes place, or at least the narration takes place, at a time when he is towards the end of his political career. And he reflects on how he really would rather be home, reading his books, playing his violin. He was a violinist. And the piece is based on a work of Corelli called La Folia, which was in his library. So this was a work that he would have played on the violin. He didn't play in public, he didn't perform, but the violin was his soul voice. And so this is an aspect of Jefferson that is the private Jefferson, the Jefferson at home, the Jefferson who really just wants to read and study and make music and garden and all of the activities that he loved so much. And so he feels that at this point that he was reluctantly pushed into society. And so I felt a real sense of simpatico with this brilliant, brilliant man. And having visited his home and seen all of his amazing inventions and the fact that he had a book stand that had, I believe, 4 or 6 panels on it of books he was reading simultaneously. He was a linguist. I mean, the man was a genius. So I focused on that. And the other aspects, the feet of clay on his pedestal, I left those aside. We all know about that. And if we tried to delve into that with every individual, there wouldn't be anybody left. I mean, we are all human. We all have flaws. And I think once we accept that, then we can go on to celebrate the great works that people, men and women, have achieved. Another male author that I feel very close to is James Joyce. Ulysses has been part of my life ever since high school, where I was told I wasn't supposed to read it, which of course is like waving the red flag in front of the bull. That's
How
the
to
first thing.
guarantee that your child will read this book is to tell them that they must not, under any circumstances, pick it up.
Right, exactly. That's a sure way to get them to read it. And even though so much of it went over my head, there was enough of it that spoke to me, particularly the Molly Bloom soliloquy at the end. And so that's the first part of the book that I set, because here's a man basically inhabiting a woman, his wife, Nora Barnacle, and writing in her voice. And this all goes to prove a theory that I have, which is that creativity is ambisextrous, if we want to coin a term, that the male and female part of a creative artist are both very strong. And so I feel in James Joyce, his understanding of a woman's perspective was so on spot that I wanted to set that. So yeah, I mean, the idea of writing about a man is as important to me as writing about a woman. And my very first opera, which was called Travels, is based on Gulliver's Travels, and it takes the perspective of Gulliver, a man. I'm now in the midst of yet a third version, but with some significant changes, and I have two wonderful creative partners that I'm working with. So it's exciting to see this work that had so much meaning to me all through these years, and to see it in yet a fuller, more complete light. And yes, it is about a man.
What was the impetus behind those changes that you're making in this iteration of Travels?
The whole idea of immigration, which is so
Very
much in
pertinent
the
for
news
today.
today. Yeah, because Gulliver, when he travels to all of these places, he is an immigrant, and basically they don't like him. They don't want him there. But he learns a lot from each place that he goes to. And so, you know, the whole idea of being a stranger in a strange land is very much part of who Gulliver is, and his whole relationship with society, of course.
It sounds like a really wonderful project. You mentioned earlier, I think, something very important about your work analyzing somebody like Thomas Jefferson with the feet of clay on the pedestal, as well as Richard Wagner, who was a wonderful composer and sort of a terrible everything else. And looking back at Mrs. President, it's really interesting because, of course, the two primary characters in this opera do not fit neatly into any clean moral archetype that we comfortably read about or comfortably watch on stage. We have to reckon with the fact that both of these characters have very lofty ideals. You know, Victoria Woodhull really, really wants to bring women's liberation in multiple fronts to the forefront of society's dialogue. And of course, the preacher from the get-go enacts great good for an individual, but also exploits the power that he has in a patriarchal system. What pushback have you gotten as you're writing these complicated characters that you don't vindicate but you don't condemn from audiences or creative teams that I think are used to having heroes or villains, or somebody has a redemption arc, or the hero is corrupted? They start in one moral camp and either wind up in the other, or they stay in one moral camp the entire time. What pushback have you gotten when your characters do not fall neatly into either box at any one point?
One of the aspects of opera that I like so much is that it's taking you on a journey. Because it's opera and because it lasts a few hours, it's a long journey where you have a chance to develop the characters and the situations and the relationships very fully. And one of the most important elements in this was my wonderful librettist, Hilary Bell. And Hilary had a lot of ideas about these characters. Because she's also a playwright, she understood that compressing the focus of this wild and woolly story, and by the way, there are a lot of biographies of Victoria Woodhull out there, and they show the complexity of her life and the hundreds of characters that are involved. But with Hilary, she really focused this on one trajectory, and that was her relationship with Henry Ward Beecher and her relationship with her goals, and not necessarily in that order. And yes, the idea of a flawed human individual was very important, a believable character. So yes, her goals are lofty, but yes, she will use almost any means, including blackmail and including exploiting her sexual charms in order to achieve her goals. And Henry Ward Beecher also would use his political power, his financial power, the power of the press to exploit her. So we found it very fascinating that these two powerful people came together, clashed, and used each other. But one of my favorite moments in the opera, and I'm sorry that I couldn't give that to you to sing because it involves you and the chorus. And we don't have a chorus
I've
for
only
this
got one
particular
larynx.
performance.
Sorry.
But the one of my favorite scenes is Victoria Woodhull has been jailed, and this is true history. She has been jailed for sending obscenity through the mail. And what was that obscenity? That was printing a story about Henry Ward Beecher and his illicit affairs in the newspaper. And so she spends election night in jail. I mean, I couldn't make up a better a better story with the contrast of somebody sitting in a lone jail cell and knowing that her dreams are over. At least the dreams in the real world, as far as being president or getting her word out. She was vilified at that point. Everybody abandoned her. Even her husband abandoned her. She was completely, completely alone. And it always makes me cry when I think of it. She sees the light, and the light is that people will come after her. They will pick up her ideas and they will carry it forward. And we had a semi-stage performance of this in Anchorage, Alaska. And there are a lot of prominent women politicians in Anchorage. And the director who staged this semi-stage production had women who were familiar to the community in Anchorage, Alaska. As she is alone on the stage in this jail cell, political women came out of the wings and they walked to the front of below the stage, and they walked through the audience. And people in the audience gasped because these were women that recognized, yes, and these were women that had achieved the part of the dream that Victoria Woodhull had imagined for them. And it took my breath away. It was so, so perfect. So I'm really eager to get a stage performance of this where we have a fully staged performance and can do the same thing with prominent women politicians or people dressed like them. Because I think that is the hope. That is, in a way, the moral of this story, if you will, is that even though this particular individual wasn't able to carry her vision to fruition, she was the one who started this path, and others picked up what she had brought to them, and they took it further. So I found that tremendously inspiring and exciting.
Really is a light at the end of a very, very long tunnel. And I would say in our current political climate, I don't think we're near the end of that tunnel yet either, but the light on some days at least seems like it's a little brighter than it was for
we got to follow that light,
Miss Woodhull. So we got to keep going in that direction. Well, Victoria, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a really, really fascinating conversation, and I've so enjoyed getting to listen to your perspectives on your work and your process. And I'm very much looking forward to performing your music in October.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I look forward to hearing you sing I'm Told I'm a Citizen.
I'm looking forward to performing it.